Have you ever wondered why, even after knowing the truth, people still chase the wrong things and why it leaves them empty every time? From ancient idols that demanded blood, pleasure, and sacrifice to modern gods quietly stealing our hearts today, the Bible exposes a pattern we still live in. This isn't just history, it's a warning and an invitation. In the next few minutes, you'll see how false gods promise everything, take everything, and why only one God gives life instead of consuming it. Let me start with a question that hits close to home. How quickly can faith fade when waiting feels uncomfortable? Because that's exactly where this story begins. Not in rebellion at first, but in impatience. Picture this moment. Moses is on Mount Sinai, standing in the presence of God, literally receiving the 10 Commandments. This isn't metaphorical. God is actively writing his law, including the command, "You shall have no other gods before me." At the very same time, down at the foot of the mountain, the people of Israel are doing the unthinkable. They melt their gold, they shape it into a calf, and then they declare, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The irony is almost unbearable. God had just delivered them from slavery. He split the sea. He fed them from heaven. And yet when Moses delayed, they replaced the invisible God with something they could see, touch, and control. And if we're honest, this isn't just an ancient problem. I've seen this same pattern play out in everyday life, when prayers feel unanswered, when waiting feels long, when silence feels unbearable. We don't melt gold anymore, but we do create substitutes: careers, relationships, money, comfort. Anything that gives us a sense of security when trust feels hard. The Israelites didn't stop believing in God. That's the scary part. They tried to worship him through the calf. Music played. Dancing broke out. It looked spiritual on the surface, but it was twisted worship. They broke the commandment while it was still being written. And this sets the stage for a dark pattern that repeats again and again in Scripture. Next comes Moloch, and this is where the story turns horrifying. Moloch wasn't a god of convenience. He was a god of terror. His worship demanded the ultimate price: children, living children. Moloch was represented by a massive metal statue with arms stretched forward. Inside was a furnace burning hot. Priests would place babies onto those arms, and as the fire consumed them, loud drums would beat to drown out the screams. That detail alone tells you something is deeply wrong, not just spiritually, but morally. What shocks me every time I read this is that this wasn't limited to pagan nations. Kings of Israel participated. King Ahaz sacrificed his own son, a father choosing power and protection over his child. God's response, recorded in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31, is chilling in its clarity. God says this is something he never commanded, nor did it even enter my mind. In other words, don't blame God for what false gods demand. And that's the thread running through all of this. False gods always take. They take innocence. They take peace. They take what should never be offered. Then we encounter Asherah, often called the Queen of Heaven. Her worship looked appealing on the surface. It was wrapped in beauty, fertility, and promise. But at its core, it exchanged holiness for sensuality. Asherah worship involved temple prostitution. Men were told they could sleep with priestesses to secure blessings for their crops. Sin was rebranded as spirituality. Desire was disguised as devotion. And here's what makes this hit hard. King Manasseh placed an Asherah idol inside the temple of God, not outside, inside. That's not just idolatry, that's compromise at the deepest level. You can't worship the Holy One while bowing to something that glorifies lust. I've seen this tension play out in real life, where people want God's blessings without God's boundaries. But Scripture makes it clear you can't blend truth with corruption and call it worship. Then comes Baal, the storm god, the weather controller, the so-called provider. People believed Baal controlled rain crops and survival. His worship involved frantic dancing, self-harm rituals, and even human sacrifice. Why did people follow him? Because agriculture meant life. Rain meant survival. Fear drove worship. And fear still drives worship today. Baal's influence spread so fast it contaminated Israel itself. That's why Elijah stood on Mount Carmel and challenged the prophets of Baal. It wasn't just a showdown, it was a statement. Only the Lord answers with fire. Only the Lord is God. Every one of these stories points to the same truth. False gods always promise control, but they deliver bondage. They offer security, but they demand your soul. And we're just getting started. There's something powerful about watching a lie collapse under its own weight. And that's exactly what happens next in Scripture. Not quietly, not symbolically, but publicly, visibly, and humiliatingly. Let's talk about Dagon, the Philistine fish god, half man and half fish. If you've ever wondered how seriously God takes idolatry, this story answers that question without mercy. When the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they treated it like a war trophy. They placed it inside Dagon's temple right next to their god as if to say, "Our God defeated yours." But what happened the next morning tells a very different story. They walked into the temple and found Dagon face down on the floor before the ark. Think about that image. A so-called god bowing before the presence of the true God. The Philistines shrugged it off, propped Dagon back up, and probably blamed it on coincidence. But God wasn't finished. The following morning, Dagon was on the ground again, this time with his head and hands broken off. Powerless, mutilated, exposed. I love how Scripture doesn't even add commentary. It doesn't need to. The message is clear: false gods can't even stand in the presence of the real one. And then comes Samson, the man whose life was messy, complicated, and painfully human. Despite his flaws, God still used him to deliver the final blow. Samson pulled down Dagon's temple with his bare hands, crushing the idol beneath the ruins. The fish god didn't save his followers. He couldn't even save himself. And that's the pattern. False gods always fail when it matters most. Next, we confront Ashtoreth, sometimes called Astarte, a fertility goddess whose influence reached even the wisest king Israel ever had. This one hits hard because Solomon wasn't ignorant. He wasn't rebellious in the beginning. He was wise, discerning, deeply blessed by God. And yet, over time, compromise crept in. Ashtoreth's worship was seductive by design. It promised pleasure, fertility, and blessing through sensual rituals. Sacred prostitution wasn't seen as sin, it was seen as devotion. The lie was simple: use your desire to manipulate divine favor. And Solomon bought it. He built shrines for Ashtoreth right outside Jerusalem. Not far away, not hidden. Right there. Visible. Accessible. A quiet betrayal that didn't look dramatic, but it changed everything. This reminds me how rarely spiritual collapse happens overnight. It usually starts with small allowances. Justifications. The belief that wisdom makes us immune. But compromise never stays small. It spreads. Then we encounter Tammuz, a god tied to season cycles and emotional attachment. Every year, his followers mourned his death during winter and celebrated his rebirth in spring. It was ritualized grief repeated year after year. Here's the heartbreaking part. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 8, verse 14, the prophet sees women of Israel sitting at the entrance of God's temple weeping for Tammuz. Let that sink in. They weren't mourning their sin. They weren't crying out to God. They were emotionally invested in a false god who died every year and never saved anyone. I've seen this kind of misplaced grief in real life, pouring tears, time, and energy into things that can't heal us. Relationships that drain us. Dreams that died long ago. Cycles that repeat but never restore. False gods don't just steal worship, they steal emotion, attention, and hope. Then comes Chemosh, the war god of the Moabites. His worship resurfaces during crisis, which tells you everything you need to know about him. Chemosh demanded child sacrifice, especially when defeat seemed inevitable. When the Moabite king was losing a battle against Israel, he sacrificed his firstborn son on the city wall. A desperate act meant to force divine intervention. And here's the scandal: Solomon built an altar to Chemosh in Jerusalem. Let that land. The same city where God placed his name now hosted a shrine to a god who consumed children. This wasn't ignorance. This was accommodation. And Scripture tells us the damage lasted for centuries. False gods don't just affect individuals, they corrupt generations. Then we move into the New Testament era, with Diana of the Ephesians, also known as Artemis. Her temple was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Worship here wasn't just spiritual, it was profitable. When the Apostle Paul preached the gospel in Ephesus, people stopped buying idols. Craftsmen lost income, and suddenly devotion turned violent. A riot broke out that lasted 2 hours with crowds shouting, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." This moment exposes something uncomfortable. Sometimes religion isn't about truth at all, it's about money. When the gospel threatens profit, false gods reveal their true power base. And here's where we pause, because what comes next is even closer to home. A god without a statue, without a temple, one that still rules hearts today. Up to this point, the false gods we've talked about look obvious: statues, temples, rituals, sacrifices. It's easy to think I would never bow to something like that. But Scripture doesn't stop with ancient idols. because the most dangerous gods are the ones that don't look religious at all. Let's start with Beelzebub. Originally called Beelzebub, meaning Lord of the Flies, this Philistine deity was associated with decay, filth, and plagues. The Israelites openly mocked him. After all, what kind of god rules over insects? Flies gather around rot and death, hardly divine. But something strange happened over time. The name Beelzebub evolved into Beelzebul and eventually became a title used for Satan himself. What started as a pathetic idol became synonymous with the ultimate enemy of God. Here's why that matters. When the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, they weren't just insulting him. They were committing spiritual blindness. They saw freedom, healing, and deliverance and called it evil. That's one of the greatest dangers of false gods. They don't just demand worship. They distort perception. They twist truth until good looks evil and evil looks justified. I've seen this in real life when people defend destructive habits, toxic beliefs, or prideful lifestyles, not because they're good, but because they feel familiar. Next, we meet Nebo, the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing. Nebo represented intellect, knowledge, education, and cultural sophistication. When Israel was taken into captivity, they were forced to acknowledge Nebo as part of Babylonian life. But Isaiah chapter 46 exposes the truth with biting sarcasm. When Babylon fell, Nebo didn't save anyone. Instead, idols were loaded onto carts and carried away like baggage. Isaiah mocks how these so-called gods needed to be carried while the God of Israel carries his people. That contrast has never left me. False gods always require effort. They demand maintenance, performance proof. You have to keep them alive. But the true God carries you when you're weak, broken, and exhausted. And now we arrive at one of the most uncomfortable names in Scripture, Mammon. Mammon isn't a statue. He has no temples, no priests, no rituals. And yet Jesus spoke about him more directly than most false gods. Jesus said you cannot serve God and Mammon. That's not a suggestion. That's a warning. Mammon represents wealth, material security, and the belief that money can provide safety, identity, and control. And unlike ancient idols, Mammon blends perfectly into modern life. It doesn't ask you to kneel, it just asks you to prioritize. I've wrestled with this one personally, not because money is evil, but because it's seductive. It promises freedom, yet quietly demands loyalty. Decisions start revolving around income instead of calling. Fear replaces faith. Trust shifts from God to numbers on a screen. And when that happens, Mammon doesn't knock on the door, he walks straight into the sanctuary and sits on the throne. What makes Mammon especially dangerous is that he doesn't feel spiritual. He feels practical, responsible, sensible. But Scripture doesn't measure gods by appearance, it measures them by allegiance. Every false god we've discussed has something in common. They demand something from you, your children, your body, your time, your emotions, your money, your future. They all take. And that brings us to the turning point, the most beautiful contrast in the entire story. While every false god demands sacrifice, Jesus Christ became the sacrifice. Let that sink in. He didn't ask you to burn your children. He didn't demand your body through exploitation. He didn't require endless rituals or cycles of grief. He gave his life once and for all. False gods promise rebirth through suffering. Jesus conquered death completely. False gods hide behind fear and manipulation. Jesus calls you by name. The real God isn't hiding behind rituals or transactions. He's not demanding payment. He's offering forgiveness. He's extending his hand. I've seen people chase counterfeits their entire lives only to end up empty, exhausted, and disillusioned. And I've seen what happens when someone finally turns to Christ. Not religion, not performance, not image, but Christ. Freedom replaces fear. Purpose replaces confusion. Peace replaces striving. And this is where the story becomes personal. Because everyone has a God. The only question is whether that God gives life or consumes it. By now, a pattern should be painfully clear. False gods are never neutral. They always cost more than they promise. And the longer they're tolerated, the higher the price becomes. What's dangerous isn't just bowing to a false god, it's slowly reorganizing your life around one. That's why Scripture doesn't just expose idols, it exposes the fruit they produce. Let's go back for a moment and look at what these gods actually took from people. Moloch took children. Asherah took purity and dignity. Baal took blood and peace. Tammuz took emotional energy year after year. Chemosh took sons in moments of desperation. Diana took truth and replaced it with profit. Mammon takes trust and calls it wisdom. Different names, same outcome. And here's the part that makes this uncomfortable: none of these gods forced worship. People chose them, not because they were good, but because they felt useful. False gods always present themselves as solutions: security, pleasure, control, identity. But they never deliver what they advertise. Instead, they slowly reshape your values until sacrifice feels normal. I've watched this happen in real life, not in temples, but in homes. Parents sacrificing time with their children for success, telling themselves it's for the family. Relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Faith sidelined because it feels inconvenient. No statues involved, just priorities quietly shifted. Scripture calls this idolatry just as clearly as carving a golden calf. That's why God's warnings are so strong. Not because he's insecure, but because he's protective. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 13, God says, "His people committed two evils. They forsook him, the fountain of living waters, and dug broken cisterns that hold no water." That image is devastating. Leaving a spring that never runs dry to dig holes that can't satisfy thirst. False gods are broken cisterns. They leak, they collapse, they disappoint. And what makes them especially dangerous is how reasonable they sound at first. Money for security, pleasure for relief, power for safety, knowledge for control, even ministry for identity. Good things can become terrible gods when they replace trust in God. This is where Solomon's story becomes a warning to all of us. Solomon didn't reject God outright. He added other gods. He tried to manage devotion instead of surrendering it. But Scripture makes something clear: divided worship always leads to divided hearts. Solomon's compromises didn't just affect him, they fractured the nation. After his death, the kingdom split. What started as personal tolerance ended as national disaster. And that's how idolatry works. It never stays private. False gods don't just distort worship, they distort morality. When Moloch demanded children, morality bent to justify it. When Asherah sanctified lust, sin became sacred. When Diana fueled commerce, truth became a threat. When mammon rules, people become numbers. I've heard people say, "I don't worship money, I just need it." But worship isn't about singing songs. It's about what you obey when decisions get hard. Jesus didn't say money was evil, he said it was a master, and masters demand loyalty. That's why Jesus framed the issue so sharply. You cannot serve both. One will eventually sit on the throne. And here's the mercy of God in all of this. He doesn't just expose idols to shame us. He exposes them to free us. Every time Scripture reveals a false god, it also reveals God's patience. Over and over he sent prophets. He warned, he called, he pleaded. Not because people deserved it, but because he loved them. Even when idols were placed inside the temple, God didn't immediately abandon his people. He stayed, he spoke, he waited. That same patience exists today. If you're listening to this and something feels uncomfortably familiar, that's not condemnation. That's conviction, and there's a difference. Condemnation pushes you away. Conviction invites you home. The real danger isn't having false gods in the world. The real danger is allowing them to remain unchallenged in your heart. Because eventually every god you serve will ask something of you. Time, money, integrity, peace, family, faith. And sooner or later the bill comes due. The question isn't whether sacrifice will happen. The question is who receives it and whether they're worthy. After walking through all these stories, ancient idols, modern masters, visible gods, and invisible ones, we arrive at a question that can't be avoided anymore. Is there any God who doesn't demand something from us? The Bible's answer is unmistakable. Every false god follows the same pattern. They take first and give nothing back. They demand sacrifice before offering hope. They consume what you love most and call it devotion. But the God of the Bible breaks that pattern completely. Christianity does not begin with human sacrifice, it begins with divine sacrifice. While Moloch demanded children, God gave his son. While Baal required blood, God shed his own. While Mammon demands trust in wealth, God invites trust in grace. This is the line that separates Jesus Christ from every other so-called God in history. Jesus didn't come asking, "What will you give me?" He came saying, "It is finished." That phrase alone rewrites everything. False gods say, "Do more." Jesus says, "It's done." False gods say, "Prove yourself." Jesus says, "I'll take your place." False gods rule through fear. Fear of loss. Fear of punishment. Fear of not having enough. Jesus rules through love. Love that absorbs punishment instead of inflicting it. Love that restores instead of exploiting. This is why the cross matters so much. At the cross, God does what no false god has ever done. He pays the cost himself. I've heard people say Christianity is just another religion. But that tells me they haven't really looked at it closely. Religion is humanity reaching up trying to earn favor. The gospel is God reaching down offering forgiveness. That's not a small difference, that's everything. Jesus doesn't promise endless cycles like Tammuz death and rebirth over and over again. He conquers death once and for all. Resurrection isn't a seasonal myth, it's a historical event. And unlike idols that collapse when empires fall, Jesus is still changing lives centuries later. I've seen people walk away from addictions that ruled them for years. I've seen marriages restored that looked beyond repair. I've seen fear loosen its grip on hearts that were drowning in anxiety. Not through rituals, not through money, not through self-effort, but through surrender to Christ. And here's the key word: surrender. Surrender doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finally being freed from masters that were never kind to you in the first place. Jesus said his yoke is easy and his burden is light. That doesn't mean life becomes effortless. It means you're no longer carrying what you were never meant to carry alone. False gods pile weight on your shoulders and call it responsibility. Jesus carries the weight with you, and often for you. And now the question turns personal. What are you serving right now? Not what you say you believe, but what shapes your decisions when no one is watching. What determines your peace? What keeps you up at night? What you protect at all costs? Everyone worships something. The Bible never argues. If we worship, it reveals what we worship. If it's money, you'll never feel secure. If it's success, you'll never feel finished. If it's pleasure, you'll never feel satisfied. If it's approval, you'll never feel enough. False gods always move the finish line. Jesus doesn't. He meets you where you are, not when you've cleaned yourself up, not when you've proven your worth, but right now. Broken, tired, skeptical, hopeful, whatever state you're in. He doesn't consume you. He restores you. That's why the invitation of Christ is so different. He doesn't force himself on anyone. He calls, he waits, he offers. And that brings us full circle. The golden calf was built because people were tired of waiting. Molech was worshipped because people were desperate for control. Mammon is served because people are afraid of the future. Jesus stands in contrast to all of it and says, do not be afraid. The real God isn't hidden behind rituals, idols, or transactions. He's not demanding payment. He's extending mercy. If this message stirred something in you, don't ignore it. That stirring isn't manipulation, it's an invitation. And if you know someone trapped in deception, someone exhausted by false promises, share this with them. You may be the voice God uses to help them see clearly for the first time. And if you want to keep uncovering biblical truth like this, truth that doesn't just inform, but transforms, stay connected. Together, we'll keep exposing the lies and pointing people to the only God who saves instead of consumes. At the end of the day, every false god takes something from you, but the true God gives himself for you. This isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror inviting us to ask who or what we're really trusting. If this message helped you see more clearly or stirred something in your heart, don't let it stop here. A simple like helps more people find this truth, and subscribing means we'll keep walking through Scripture together honestly, deeply, and with real life in view.